The call came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, unremarkable day that felt designed to absorb bad news without making it feel worse. Sarah was at work when her phone rang, the number unfamiliar but local, the area code one she recognized from years of trying to forget it. She let it ring twice before answering, already bracing herself for whatever was on the other end. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was formal, careful, belonging to someone who made these kinds of calls often enough to have perfected the tone. "Yes." "This is Patricia Holbrook from Holbrook and Associates. I'm calling regarding your uncle, Marcus Chen. I'm very sorry to inform you that he passed away 3 days ago." Sarah stopped walking. The hallway around her continued its usual rhythm, people passing with folders and coffee cups, conversations overlapping in fragments. But she stood still, phone pressed to her ear, feeling the floor solidify beneath her feet in a way that made her suddenly aware of how unsteady everything else was. "I see," she said, because there was nothing else to say. She had not spoken to Marcus in over 2 years, not since the last family gathering had dissolved into accusations and slammed doors. Before that, the gaps had been growing longer, the reasons more entrenched. Still, hearing it stated so plainly, reduced to a legal notification, hollowed something out inside her. The lawyer continued, explaining arrangements, timelines, formalities. There would be a reading of the will. Attendance was requested, but not required. Sarah agreed to everything mechanically, writing down the date and time on the back of a receipt she pulled from her pocket. When the call ended, she stood there for several more seconds, staring at the numbers she had written, before finally moving again. She did not cry. That would come later, in smaller, unexpected moments. For now, there was only the quiet weight of an ending she had seen coming, but never quite believed would arrive. Marcus had been her father's younger brother, a man who had lived his life on the edges of the family, close enough to be unavoidable, distant enough to remain mysterious. He had never married, never had children, never held a job that anyone could explain clearly at gatherings. He lived modestly in a small house on the outskirts of town, kept to himself, and showed up to family events only when absolutely necessary. Sarah had liked him. In the way you like someone who never asks for more than you can give. He had been kind to her when she was young, patient in a way her own parents rarely managed. But as she grew older and the family fractures deepened, Marcus had retreated further, until he became little more than a name mentioned occasionally, usually with frustration or dismissal. The funeral was small. Sarah arrived alone, parking her aging sedan at the far end of the lot, giving herself time to prepare before walking toward the chapel. Inside, the attendance was exactly what she expected. A handful of distant relatives, a few neighbors who had known Marcus casually, and her immediate family, her mother, her 2 older brothers, David and Richard, and their wives, all seated in the front rows, with expressions that ranged from solemn to impatient. Her mother saw her first, a brief glance that registered her presence without warmth. Sarah slid into a pew near the back, keeping distance between herself and the rest of them. The service was brief, impersonal, conducted by a minister who clearly had not known Marcus well. The eulogy relied on generalities: kind man, quiet life, missed by those who knew him. No one from the family spoke. No one offered stories or memories. When it ended, people filed out quickly, as though relieved to return to their own lives. Sarah lingered, waiting until the chapel emptied before approaching the casket. She stood there for a long time, looking at the face that had been made peaceful and distant by death, trying to reconcile it with the man she remembered. In the end, she placed her hand briefly on the polished wood, whispered something she wasn't sure even she believed, and walked away. The reading of the will took place 2 days later in a conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old carpet. Sarah arrived early, taking a seat near the window, watching as the others filtered in. Her mother entered first, flanked by David and Richard, both dressed in suits that looked expensive and uncomfortable. Their wives followed, silent and observant. No one greeted Sarah directly. The acknowledgement was minimal. A nod here, a tight smile there. Nothing that suggested warmth or reconciliation. Patricia Holbrook entered last, carrying a leather folder and an air of professional detachment. She settled at the head of the table, adjusted her glasses, and began without preamble. Thank you all for coming. Marcus Chen's estate is relatively straightforward. There are a few specific bequests, and the remainder will be divided according to the instructions he left. She opened the folder and began reading. The language was formal, dense with legal phrasing that made simple things sound complicated. Sarah listened without expectation. Marcus had lived modestly. Whatever he left behind would likely be modest as well. She was not here for money. She was here because it felt like the right thing to do, the last gesture of respect she could offer. The first bequests were small, a few $1,000s to a local charity, some books to a neighbor who had checked on him occasionally, a watch to a friend no one in the room recognized. Then Patricia's tone shifted slightly, becoming more deliberate. To my nephews, David Chen and Richard Chen, I leave the sum of $10,000 each to be distributed equally. David and Richard exchanged glances, their expressions tightening. $10,000 was not nothing, but it was less than they had expected. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind their eyes, the quick reassessment of what Marcus had been worth, what they had assumed he possessed. Patricia continued. To my sister-in-law, Margaret Chen, I leave my savings account, currently valued at approximately $32,000. Margaret's face remained neutral, but her hands folded more tightly in her lap. It was more than the boys had received, but still, the sum was smaller than anticipated. The room settled into a tense stillness, everyone waiting to hear what came next, where the rest of the estate would go. To my niece, Sarah Chen, Patricia said, her voice steady. I leave the contents of my workshop, including all tools, materials, and the cedar chest that belonged to my father. Silence. Then a sound that might have been a scoff, quickly suppressed. Sarah looked up, meeting Patricia's gaze, searching for clarification. A workshop? Tools? She had not even known Marcus had a workshop. That's it. David's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, and disbelieving. She gets a bunch of old junk, and we're supposed to just accept that? Patricia did not react to the tone. The will is clear. The specific bequests have been outlined. The remaining assets, including the house and any other property, will be sold, with proceeds distributed, according to the percentages Marcus specified. What percentages? Richard leaned forward, his voice controlled, but edged with frustration. Patricia read from the document. 50% to Margaret Chen, 25% each to David and Richard Chen. Sarah Chen receives no portion of the house sale. The words hung in the air, reshaping the room's dynamics. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken accusations. She had been given something, but not the thing that mattered. The house would sell for a reasonable amount, enough to make the percentages significant. And she had been excluded from that entirely. Why? Margaret's voice was quiet, but firm. Why would he do that? Patricia closed the folder. I don't have insight into Marcus's reasoning. I can only execute what he instructed. David stood abruptly. This is absurd. She doesn't even need anything from the workshop. She's never built a thing in her life. Sarah remained seated, her hands resting in her lap, willing herself to stay calm. I didn't ask for any of this, but you're taking it, aren't you? Richard's tone was colder than his brother's, more calculated. You'll take whatever you can get, just like always. That's not fair, Sarah said quietly. but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Fair had stopped meaning anything in this family years ago. Margaret raised a hand, silencing her sons with a gesture. Enough. The will is legal. We'll contest if necessary, but for now, we follow procedure. She turned to Patricia. When can we access the property? The house will remain sealed until the estate is fully processed. However, the specific bequests can be claimed immediately. Sarah, you'll need to arrange to collect the items from the workshop within the next 2 weeks. The meeting dissolved quickly after that, everyone eager to leave the confined space and the uncomfortable reality it contained. Sarah remained seated as the others filed out, waiting until she was alone with Patricia. Can I ask you something? Sarah's voice was hesitant. Patricia looked up, her expression softening slightly. Of course. Did he say anything about why? About the workshop or the chest? Patricia considered the question, then shook her head. Not directly. But when we discussed the will, he mentioned that you were the only one who ever asked him questions. He said you listened when he talked about his father, about the old days. He thought you might understand what the chest meant. Sarah nodded slowly, though she did not understand. Not yet. Thank you. There's one more thing. Patricia reached into her folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. He asked me to give this to you personally. It's not part of the legal documents, just a letter. Sarah took the envelope, feeling its weight, the slight thickness that suggested more than a single page. She slipped it into her bag without opening it, not ready to read whatever Marcus had wanted her to know. That night, alone in her small apartment, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. She had lived here for 3 years, ever since the divorce had finalized, and the legal bills had consumed most of what she had saved. The place was small, affordable, and anonymous. It served its purpose. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the pages inside. Marcus's handwriting was neat, precise, the letters formed with the care of someone who rarely wrote by hand anymore. Sarah, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably confused about why I left you what I did. I don't blame you. It doesn't make sense unless you know the whole story, and I never told anyone the whole story, not even you. The workshop was where I spent most of my time in the last decade. It was the only place I felt like I was doing something that mattered, even if no one else saw it that way. I built things there, fixed things, worked with my hands the way my father taught me. The tools are good quality. If you don't want them, sell them. They're worth more than people think. But the chest, that's different. That chest belonged to our father, your grandfather. He made it himself decades ago before any of us were born. He was a craftsman, Sarah, a real one. Not many people knew that about him. He worked in a factory most of his life, but in his spare time, he built furniture, cabinets, boxes, beautiful work, precise. The chest was his masterpiece, or at least that's what he always said. When he died, the chest was supposed to go to your father, my brother. But your father didn't want it. He said it was too old-fashioned, too heavy, not worth the space. So it sat in storage for years, and eventually I took it. I've kept it all this time, not because it's valuable in the way people usually mean, but because it mattered to him. And because I thought someday, someone in the family might care about that. I'm giving it to you because I think you might be that person. You were always the one who listened. When I talked about Dad, about the old days, you didn't dismiss it as nostalgia. You asked questions. You wanted to know. That matters more than you realize. Take care of it, Sarah. Or don't. It's yours now. Do with it what you think is right. Marcus. Sarah read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to extract meaning beyond the words. Marcus had been sentimental about the chest, that much was clear. But why had he excluded her from the house sale? Why structure the will in a way that would create resentment? She folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, then stood and moved to the window. Outside, the city stretched into darkness. Lights scattered across the landscape like stars that had fallen and forgotten how to rise. She thought about her grandfather, a man she had barely known, who had died when she was still young. She remembered him vaguely, a quiet presence at family gatherings, someone who smiled more than he spoke. And now she had inherited his chest, a piece of furniture that no one else had wanted, given to her by an uncle who had seen something in her that the rest of the family had missed or dismissed. She did not know yet what that meant, but she knew she would go to the workshop. She would see what Marcus had left behind, and she would take the chest, not because it was valuable, but because it felt like the only honest thing left in a family that had forgotten how to be honest with each other. The workshop was located in a part of town Sarah rarely visited, an area where industrial buildings gave way to older residential streets, where houses sat close together and driveways were cracked with age. Marcus's house was small, single-story, painted a faded blue that might have been vibrant once, but had dulled under years of weather. The yard was overgrown, not wild, but neglected, as though someone had stopped caring about appearances long ago. Sarah parked on the street and sat for a moment, studying the house. It looked empty in a way that went beyond vacancy. It looked like a place that had been waiting for something that never arrived. She walked up the narrow path to the front door, where Patricia had told her a key would be left under a planter. She found it easily, brushed off the dirt, and unlocked the door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The furniture was minimal, functional, nothing that suggested comfort or personality. Marcus had lived here, but it did not feel like he had made it home. The workshop was accessed through a door in the kitchen, leading down a short set of stairs into what had once been a basement. Sarah descended slowly, her hand trailing along the wall for balance. At the bottom, she reached for a light switch and flipped it, illuminating the space below. The workshop was larger than she expected, stretching the full length of the house. The walls were lined with pegboards holding tools, each one hung in its designated place, organized with a precision that spoke of care and routine. A workbench dominated one side, its surface scarred and stained but clean. Shelves held boxes of nails, screws, sandpaper, small containers labeled in Marcus's neat handwriting. Everything was orderly, intentional, the space of someone who found meaning in structure. And in the center of the room, sitting on a low platform as though it had been placed there for display, was the chest. It was larger than Sarah had imagined, roughly 4 feet long, 2 feet deep, made from dark cedar that had aged into a rich, deep tone. The craftsmanship was immediately apparent, even to someone with no expertise. The joints were seamless, the corners perfectly aligned. The surface was smooth, polished, though time had left faint marks, small scratches, areas where the wood had darkened unevenly. The lid was flat, unadorned except for a simple brass latch that looked original. Sarah approached slowly, feeling an unexpected reverence. This was not just furniture. It was work, evidence of skill and patience, something built to last, not just years, but generations. She knelt beside it and ran her hand along the top, feeling the grain beneath her fingers. The wood was cool, solid, heavier than she expected when she tested its weight by lifting one corner slightly. She unlatched the lid and opened it carefully. Inside, the chest was empty except for a faint smell of cedar, clean and sharp, preserved by the wood's natural oils. The interior was lined with the same material, sanded smooth, fitted precisely. There were no compartments, no hidden drawers that she could see, just a simple, open space. She lowered the lid again and sat back on her heels, studying the chest from a distance. Why had Marcus valued this so much? Why had her grandfather spent so much time building it? It was beautiful, certainly, but it was also just a box. Functional, well-made, but ultimately ordinary. Sarah spent the next hour exploring the workshop, examining the tools, opening drawers, reading the labels Marcus had left. She found plans for projects he had worked on, sketches of furniture, notes about measurements and materials. There were photographs, too, old ones, tucked into a drawer. Images of her grandfather, younger than she had ever seen him, standing beside finished pieces, his expression serious but satisfied. One photograph caught her attention. It showed her grandfather holding a small wooden box, ornately carved, clearly a gift or commission. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Commissioned piece, 1965. Double lock mechanism." Sarah studied the image, noting the detail in the carving, the way the box seemed to have layers, depth. She thought about the chest again. Her grandfather had been a craftsman who understood complexity, who built things with hidden features, with purposes that were not immediately obvious. Could the chest be more than it appeared? She returned to it, kneeling again, this time with more focus. She examined the exterior carefully, running her hands along every surface, checking for seams, for irregularities, for anything that might suggest a hidden element. The wood was consistent, smooth, unbroken. She opened the lid and checked the interior again, pressing against the lining, feeling for give or movement. Nothing. She measured the exterior dimensions mentally, then compared them to the interior. The math seemed straightforward. The walls were thick, as they should be for structural integrity, but not unusually so. There was no obvious discrepancy, no hidden space that revealed itself easily. Still, the doubt persisted. Why would Marcus emphasize this chest so much if it were truly just a simple box? Why structure his will to ensure she received it, even at the cost of alienating the rest of the family? Sarah sat on the workshop floor, legs crossed, staring at the chest as though it might speak if she waited long enough. The light from the single bulb overhead cast long shadows, and the silence of the empty house pressed in around her. She felt the weight of the moment, the sense that she was missing something obvious, something that Marcus had expected her to see. But for now, the chest kept its secrets, if it had any to keep. And Sarah, exhausted by the funeral, the will reading, the family tension, decided that understanding could wait. She would take the chest home, live with it for a while, let familiarity reveal what scrutiny could not. She stood, brushed dust from her jeans, and began the process of figuring out how to move something that heavy on her own. Getting the chest out of Marcus's house required more effort than Sarah had anticipated. It was not just heavy, it was dense, the kind of weight that suggested solidity all the way through. No hollow spaces, no shortcuts in construction. She tried lifting one end, then the other, testing whether she could drag it across the floor. The wood barely moved, scraping faintly against the concrete, protesting the indignity of being pulled rather than carried. She paused, breathing hard, and looked around the workshop for something that might help. Near the workbench, she found an old furniture dolly, its wheels worn but functional. It took several attempts to maneuver the chest onto the platform, tilting it carefully, sliding the dolly beneath, lowering it back down with controlled tension. Once secured, the chest rolled more easily, though guiding it up the basement stairs required patience and balance, each step negotiated slowly to avoid tipping. By the time she maneuvered it through the house and out the front door, sweat dampened her shirt despite the cool air. Her car, a mid-sized sedan that had seen better years, waited at the curb. She lowered the tailgate hatch and stared at the gap between the dolly and the trunk. Calculating angles and force distribution the way someone does when they have no choice but to figure it out alone. It took 3 attempts. The first 2 ended with the chest sliding back onto the dolly, too heavy to lift cleanly into the trunk. On the 3rd try, she braced her legs differently, used the curb for leverage, and managed to slide the chest into the cargo area, where it settled with a solid thud that made the car's suspension compress visibly. She closed the hatch carefully, aware that the weight was pushing limits, then stood for a moment, hands on her hips, catching her breath. The drive back to her apartment was slow, cautious. Every bump in the road registered differently, the car responding sluggishly, the rear end sitting lower than usual. Sarah kept her speed moderate, taking corners wide, avoiding sudden stops. By the time she pulled into her apartment complex parking lot, her shoulders ached from tension, and her hands were cramped from gripping the wheel too tightly. Getting the chest into her apartment presented a different challenge. The building had no elevator. Her unit was on the 2nd floor, accessed by an exterior staircase that was narrow, steep, and poorly lit. She considered asking a neighbor for help, but it was late afternoon, and the complex was quiet, most people still at work or deliberately avoiding interaction. She had learned that city apartments fostered a particular kind of privacy, where everyone knew everyone existed, but no one wanted to be responsible for anyone else. She dragged the chest out of the car and onto the dolly again, then began the slow process of pulling it backward up the stairs, one step at a time. The wheels caught on the edges, forcing her to lift slightly with each ascent, her arms burning, her breath coming in short bursts. Halfway up, she had to stop, leaning against the railing, letting the weight rest briefly before continuing. A neighbor passed on their way down, glanced at her struggling, offered a vague, "Need help?" in a tone that suggested they hoped the answer was no. Sarah shook her head, too tired to explain, and the neighbor continued without pausing. At the top of the stairs, she dragged the chest along the exterior walkway to her door, fumbled with her keys, and finally maneuvered it inside. The apartment felt smaller with the chest in it, the space suddenly dominated by this piece of furniture that did not belong to her life, her aesthetic, or her circumstances. She pushed it against the far wall of the living room, out of the main path, and collapsed onto her couch, staring at it. The chest sat there, silent and imposing, refusing to integrate into the surroundings. Everything else in the apartment was temporary, assembled from thrift stores and hand-me-downs, chosen for function over form. The chest, by contrast, was permanent, built to outlast everything around it. It made the rest of the room look cheaper, more disposable, a reminder of how little she had managed to accumulate in 3 years of living here. Sarah closed her eyes and let exhaustion wash over her. She would deal with the chest later. For now, it was enough that she had brought it home, that she had honored Marcus's wishes, even if she did not yet understand them. That evening, after a shower and a microwaved meal she barely tasted, Sarah sat on the floor in front of the chest, legs folded beneath her, and opened it again. The cedar smell filled the small room, stronger now, as though the wood had been waiting to breathe in a space that was lived in. She reached inside, running her hands along the interior walls, pressing gently, feeling for anything unusual. The lining was smooth, unbroken, fitted so precisely that no seams were visible. She lifted the lid higher, examining the hinges. They were brass, simple, functional, showing signs of age but no evidence of tampering or modification. She checked the latch, the corners, the base, every visible joint. Nothing suggested hidden mechanisms or secret compartments. It was, as far as she could determine, exactly what it appeared to be: a well-made cedar chest, built by a craftsman who took pride in his work, but ultimately just a chest. Still, the doubt lingered. Marcus's letter had been specific. He had emphasized the chest in a way that felt deliberate, meaningful. And the photograph of her grandfather with the double-lock box suggested he had built things with complexity, with layers that were not immediately obvious. Sarah closed the lid and sat back, frustrated. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe Marcus had simply been sentimental, and the chest's value was emotional, not practical. Maybe there was no hidden fortune, no secret compartment, no revelation waiting to be discovered. Maybe it was just a reminder of a man she had barely known, left to her because no one else had cared enough to want it. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, something resisted. Marcus had structured his will carefully, deliberately. He had excluded her from the house sale, knowing it would create resentment, knowing the family would question his decisions. He had done that for a reason. And the only thing he had given her, the only thing he had singled out as hers alone, was this chest. Sarah leaned forward again, studying the chest from a different angle. The exterior dimensions were roughly 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep. She measured the interior with her hands, approximating the space. 4 feet long, 2 feet wide. But the depth? She paused, pressing her hand against the bottom. The interior felt shallower than it should, maybe 18 inches instead of 2 feet. She stood and retrieved a tape measure from the small toolbox she kept under the sink, then returned to the chest. She measured the exterior height carefully, 24 inches. Then she opened the lid and measured the interior depth, 18 inches, 6 inches unaccounted for. Her pulse quickened. She closed the lid and examined the base of the chest, looking for seams, for panels, for anything that might indicate a false bottom. The exterior was smooth, continuous, the corners perfectly joined. She tilted the chest slightly, testing its weight distribution. It felt uniformly heavy, no shift in balance that might suggest an empty cavity. She needed tools. Sarah returned to the kitchen and gathered what she had: a flathead screwdriver, a butter knife, a small flashlight. Back in the living room, she knelt beside the chest and began examining the interior lining more carefully, looking for edges, for places where the wood might separate. The lining appeared to be glued down, fitted tightly against the walls and base. She tested the corners first, pressing the screwdriver gently into the seams, checking for give. Nothing. She moved to the center of the base, tapping lightly with her knuckles. The sound was solid, consistent, no hollow echo that might indicate space beneath. But the math did not lie. 6 inches were missing. Sarah sat back, thinking. If her grandfather had built a false bottom, he would have done it well, precisely, in a way that would not be discovered accidentally. It would require intention to find, knowledge to access. She thought about the photograph again, the double lock mechanism. What if the chest had something similar? Not a lock, but a release, a way to open what was hidden without destroying it. She examined the interior again, this time focusing on small details, on places where pressure might activate something, where a hidden latch might exist. She pressed along the edges, testing each corner, each seam. Nothing responded. She was missing something. She knew it with the same certainty she had felt reading Marcus's letter. The chest was more than it appeared. Her grandfather had built it that way. Marcus had preserved it for that reason. And now it was hers, waiting for her to understand what they had both known. But understanding did not come that night. After an hour of searching, testing, examining every surface she could reach, Sarah finally gave up, exhausted and frustrated. She closed the chest, turned off the lights, and went to bed, where sleep came slowly, interrupted by thoughts of hidden spaces and secrets that refused to reveal themselves. In the days that followed, the chest became a presence in her life, something she passed multiple times daily, something that demanded attention even when she tried to ignore it. She found herself staring at it while drinking her morning coffee, studying it from different angles, as though perspective alone might unlock what careful examination had not. She measured it again, confirming the discrepancy. 6 inches. Not enough for a fortune, but enough for something. Papers, maybe. Documents. Something flat. Something that did not require much space, but mattered enough to hide. The thought that it might contain nothing, that the false bottom existed only as a demonstration of craftsmanship, a builder's signature rather than a secret, began to feel more plausible. Maybe her grandfather had simply enjoyed the challenge of creating something complex, and Marcus had valued it for that reason alone. Maybe she was searching for meaning where only skill existed, but she could not fully accept that explanation. Not yet. Not until she had exhausted every possibility. Sarah began researching online, searching for information about antique furniture, about hidden compartments, about techniques craftsmen used in mid-century construction. She found forums where collectors discussed similar pieces, where people shared stories of discovering false bottoms in old trunks, of finding love letters, old currency, photographs tucked away decades earlier. Most of the discoveries were sentimental, not valuable. A few mentioned cash, small amounts that had been saved and forgotten. One story described finding war bonds that had appreciated over time, worth far more than their original value. But nothing suggested the kind of fortune that would justify Marcus's careful orchestration, his deliberate exclusion of her from the house sale. Unless he had known something. Unless the chest contained something that would make the house money irrelevant. Sarah's financial situation made it hard to focus on anything but immediate survival. The divorce had left her with debt she was still paying down, legal fees that had consumed her savings, and a job that paid enough to cover rent and groceries, but left little room for error. She had learned to measure her life in careful increments, in budgets stretched across weeks, in decisions about what could be delayed and what could not. The chest, sitting in her living room, represented something beyond that careful calculus. It was evidence of a different kind of wealth, the wealth of time, of skill, of care invested in creating something meant to last. But it did not pay bills. It did not reduce debt. And as the days passed and the mystery remained unsolved, Sarah began to feel the practical weight of the situation. The chest was taking up space she did not have, occupying mental energy she could not afford to spare. She considered selling it. Antique furniture had value, and a piece this well-made might attract collectors, might fetch enough to make a difference in her financial situation. But every time she considered the idea seriously, she thought of Marcus's letter, of the deliberate way he had given it to her, and she hesitated. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain what she had. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after bringing the chest home, Sarah returned from work to find a message on her phone. It was from David, her older brother, his voice clipped and formal in the way it always became when he wanted something but did not want to ask directly. "Sarah, it's David. We need to talk about the estate. There are some complications with the house sale, and Mom thinks it would be good if we all sat down together. This weekend, if you're available. Let me know." Sarah listened to the message twice, noting what was said and what was not. Complications likely meant someone had questioned the will, had raised objections, had tried to alter the distribution Marcus had outlined. And they wanted her there, which meant they needed something from her. Probably her agreement, her signature, her compliance with whatever solution they had decided upon. She deleted the message without calling back. Whatever complications existed, they were not hers to solve. Marcus had made his decisions. She would honor them, even if the rest of the family did not. But the call unsettled her. It reminded her that the chest was not just a mystery. It was a focal point for resentment, a visible symbol of the family fracture that had been growing for years. If she discovered that it contained nothing, that Marcus had given her a beautiful but ultimately empty box, the humiliation would be shared, public, something her family would use to confirm what they already believed, that she had been foolish to accept it, foolish to hope for anything more. That night, Sarah sat in front of the chest again, her hands resting on its surface, and made a decision. She would find the answer, not because she needed the validation, not because she wanted to prove anything to her family, but because she owed it to Marcus, and perhaps to herself, to see this through to its conclusion. Whatever the chest held or did not hold, she would know. And then, finally, she could move forward, with or without the weight of its mystery. The weekend came and went without Sarah responding to David's message. She spent Saturday morning at the library, a place she had always found more conducive to focus than her cramped apartment. The library's reference section contained older books on woodworking and furniture construction, volumes that predated the internet's dominance, written by craftsmen who had learned their trade through apprenticeship rather than online tutorials. She pulled several books from the shelves and settled into a corner table, reading methodically, taking notes. The chapters on hidden compartments were surprisingly detailed. Apparently, secret drawers and false bottoms had been common in furniture from certain periods, built not for criminal purposes, but for practical ones, storing valuables in homes where locks were unreliable, concealing documents in desks used by people who valued privacy. The mechanisms varied. Some relied on simple spring releases, pressure points that, when activated in sequence, would unlock a panel. Others used magnetic catches, weight distribution, or sliding components that required specific manipulation. The more sophisticated examples involved multiple steps, a kind of puzzle that ensured only someone who knew the solution could access what was hidden. Sarah studied diagrams showing cross-sections of antique desks and trunks, noting how craftsmen created the illusion of continuous space while actually dividing it into layers. The key, she learned, was precision. The false bottom had to fit so seamlessly that casual inspection would reveal nothing, and the release mechanism had to be subtle enough to avoid accidental discovery, but intuitive enough that the intended user could access it without destroying the piece. She thought about her grandfather, about the photograph of him holding the box with the double lock mechanism. If he had applied similar principles to the chest, the release would not be obvious. It would require knowledge, intention, perhaps even a specific sequence of actions. By early afternoon, Sarah had filled several pages with notes, sketches, and observations. She checked out 3 books and returned to her apartment, her mind already working through possibilities. The chest was waiting for her, exactly where she had left it, patient and inscrutable. She set the books on the floor beside it and began a new examination, this time informed by what she had learned. She was looking for pressure points, for panels that might slide rather than lift, for components that served dual purposes. She started with the interior corners, pressing each one firmly, testing whether any gave way or triggered movement elsewhere. Nothing. She moved to the base, running her fingers along the seam where the lining met the walls. In one corner, near the back, she felt something different. Not a gap exactly, but a slight irregularity in the texture. A place where the grain of the wood changed direction almost imperceptibly. She pressed harder, and the panel shifted, just barely, before settling back into place. Her breath caught. She pressed again, this time holding the pressure steady. The panel remained in place, but she could feel resistance, as though something beneath was resisting the force. She released the pressure and examined the spot more closely with her flashlight. The seam was nearly invisible, but it was there, a hairline separation that had been disguised by the grain pattern. She tried pressing other corners in sequence, testing whether multiple points needed to be activated simultaneously. The opposite corner, when pressed, produced a similar slight shift. She held both corners down at once and felt something release. A quiet click that was more vibration than sound. The panel did not lift. Instead, it slid sideways, smooth and controlled, revealing a narrow gap at the edge of the false bottom. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. The entire base panel shifted, sliding out on hidden rails that had been built into the chest structure. Beneath it was a compartment, shallow but wide, exactly the 6 inches her measurements had identified. And it was not empty. Sarah stared into the space, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The compartment was filled with papers, stacked neatly, organized with the same precision that had gone into the chest's construction. But these were not ordinary documents. Even from a distance, even in the dim light of her apartment, she could see that they were old, formal, printed on heavy stock that had yellowed with age, but remained intact. She reached in carefully and lifted the first stack. The papers were bound with a ribbon that disintegrated slightly at her touch, the fibers dry and fragile. She set them on the floor beside her and examined the top document. It was a stock certificate. The header read, Standard Oil Company. The date printed in ornate script, 1911. The certificate itself was beautifully designed, with intricate borders and engraved imagery, the kind of craftsmanship that had gone into financial documents before computers standardized everything. The number of shares was listed clearly, 500 shares, and the name of the shareholder was printed in careful type, Thomas Chen, her great-grandfather. Sarah's hands shook as she set the certificate aside and reached for the next document. Another stock certificate, this one from a company she did not recognize, American Tobacco, dated 1915. Then another, from a railroad company that no longer existed. And another, each one representing shares purchased decades ago, held in names she vaguely remembered from family stories, relatives who had died long before she was born. She worked through the stack methodically, her initial excitement giving way to a kind of focused calm. Each certificate was examined, its details noted, its condition assessed. The papers were old, some nearly a century old, but they had been preserved carefully, kept dry and protected from light. Many were in excellent condition, the printing still crisp, the signatures still legible. Beneath the stock certificates were bonds, government bonds, corporate bonds, municipal bonds, all issued in the early to mid-20th century, all purchased in small denominations by people who had saved carefully, who had believed in the future even when the present was uncertain. Sarah recognized some of the dates, 1920s, 1930s, the years of the Depression, when buying bonds had been an act of faith as much as investment. The sheer volume was overwhelming. She counted quickly, estimating. Dozens of certificates, maybe more than 100, each one representing value that had been locked away, forgotten, or deliberately hidden, left to accumulate in silence for generations. She sat back, her legs numb from kneeling, and tried to think clearly. Stock certificates from the early 1900s, companies that no longer existed, or that had merged, split, changed names. How much could they possibly be worth? Were they even valid anymore? Did old stock certificates retain value, or were they just historical curiosities, interesting but ultimately worthless? Her rational mind wanted to temper her excitement, to remind her that paper did not equal wealth, that age did not guarantee value. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to search the chest in the first place, whispered something different. Marcus had hidden these for a reason. Her grandfather had built a secret compartment for a reason. This was not a collection of worthless paper. This was an inheritance, carefully preserved, waiting for the right person to find it. Sarah pulled out her phone and began searching. "Old stock certificates value," she typed, then paused. Realizing how vague that was, she refined the search, Standard Oil 1911 stock certificate worth, and waited as results loaded. The information that appeared was dense, technical, filled with terms she did not fully understand. Stock splits, mergers, successor companies, adjusted values. But certain phrases stood out. Original Standard Oil shares highly valuable. Certificates from pre-breakup can be worth significant amounts. Authentication required for historical stocks. She clicked on a link to a forum where collectors discussed old certificates. One post caught her attention, a person describing how they had found Standard Oil shares from 1910 in their grandmother's attic. The shares, after being authenticated and traced through corporate mergers, had been worth over $30,000. $30,000. For a single certificate. Sarah looked down at the stack beside her. She had counted at least 20 Standard Oil certificates so far, and there were more in the compartment, many more. Her pulse quickened. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. She could not let excitement cloud her judgment. These certificates needed to be authenticated, appraised, verified. She could not assume they were all valuable. Some might be worthless, shares in companies that had gone bankrupt, bonds that had never been redeemed. But even if only a fraction of them held value, even if the estimates she was finding online were remotely accurate, she was looking at a sum that could change her life. She continued pulling documents from the compartment, working carefully now, aware that she was handling something fragile, something that required preservation. Beneath the stocks and bonds, she found another layer, these wrapped in cloth that had protected them even more thoroughly. She unwrapped the first bundle and found herself holding something different. Not a stock certificate, but a bearer bond, issued in 1928, denomination $10,000. The bond was larger than the stock certificates, more formal, with language that declared it payable to the bearer, meaning whoever physically held it could claim its value. Sarah's knowledge of finance was limited, but she understood the implication. Bearer bonds were essentially cash in paper form. If these bonds were still valid, if they had not been redeemed, they could be worth their face value, plus decades of accumulated interest. She counted the bearer bonds carefully. There were 15 of them. Each for $10,000. $150,000 in face value alone, issued nearly a century ago. She set them aside, her hands trembling now, not with excitement, but with the weight of responsibility. This was not a small discovery. This was a fortune, hidden in plain sight, passed down through generations who had either forgotten it existed or had deliberately kept it secret. The final layer of the compartment contained something different still. A small leather journal, its cover worn but intact, its pages filled with handwritten entries in a script she did not immediately recognize. She opened it carefully, angling it toward the light. The entries were dated, starting in 1910 and continuing through the 1950s, written in what appeared to be her great-grandfather's hand. Based on the similarity to signatures on the stock certificates, the journal was a record, a ledger of purchases, of investments made over decades, each entry noting the company, the number of shares, the purchase price, and occasionally a brief note about why the investment had been made. Sarah read through the entries slowly, absorbing the scope of what she was seeing. Her great-grandfather had been methodical, disciplined, investing small amounts consistently over years. buying shares during market downturns when prices were low, holding them through recoveries. The journal showed a strategy, a long-term vision that had extended beyond his own lifetime. And at the end of the journal, on a page dated 1955, there was a final entry, written in a different hand, her grandfather's, she assumed. These investments represent more than 50 years of careful planning by my father and his father before him. They were purchased during times of hardship, held through uncertainty, and preserved for the future. I am adding them to the chest Thomas built, trusting that they will be found by someone who understands their value, not just financially, but as evidence of perseverance and faith in what comes next. May they serve whoever finds them well. Sarah read the passage 3 times, feeling the weight of those words. This was not just money. It was legacy, a tangible connection to people she had never known, who had sacrificed and saved and believed that their efforts would matter to someone, someday. She closed the journal and set it carefully beside the other documents, then leaned back against the couch. Staring at the papers spread across her living room floor, the apartment, which had felt small and temporary, now held something enormous, something that did not fit within the boundaries of her ordinary life. The immediate question was practical. What now? She could not simply walk into a bank with a stack of century-old stock certificates and expect them to hand over money. There would be a process, authentication, appraisals, legal verification. She would need experts, people who specialized in historical financial documents, who could trace the lineage of these companies, determine which certificates retained value, and facilitate their conversion into liquid assets. But before any of that, she needed to understand the full scope of what she had. She returned to the compartment and removed the remaining documents. Working systematically, organizing them by type, by date, by company. The task took hours. By the time she finished, the floor around her was covered with stacks of paper, each one representing a piece of a larger puzzle. She made lists, tallying the certificates by company. Standard Oil appeared most frequently, 23 certificates in various denominations. American Tobacco, 15 certificates. Railroad companies, utilities, manufacturing firms, each represented by multiple shares, purchased across different years. The bonds were easier to quantify, 15 bearer bonds at $10,000 each. Government bonds totaling another $50,000 in face value, municipal bonds from cities that still existed, issued during infrastructure projects in the 1920s and 1930s. Even without expert appraisal, even with conservative estimates, Sarah was looking at a sum that made her pause, that forced her to reconsider everything she had assumed about her situation, her family's history, her grandfather's legacy. If the online estimates were even remotely accurate, if the certificates could be authenticated and the bonds redeemed, she was not looking at thousands of dollars. She was looking at hundreds of thousands, possibly more. The realization settled on her slowly, not as joy or relief, but as a kind of vertigo. Her life, which had been carefully balanced on the edge of sustainability, had just been tilted into territory she could not yet comprehend. She was still the same person, with the same debts, the same job, the same small apartment. But everything beneath that surface had shifted fundamentally. She thought about Marcus, about the deliberate way he had structured his will, giving her the chest while excluding her from the house sale. Had he known? Had he understood what the chest contained? Or had he simply trusted that it mattered, that it deserved to be found? She thought about the rest of her family, about the $10,000 David and Richard had received, the $32,000 her mother had gotten. Those sums had felt significant at the time, enough to create resentment that Sarah had been excluded. But compared to what she was looking at now, they were almost insulting, a fraction of what had been hidden, kept secret, preserved for someone who would value it properly. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot, the neighboring buildings, the ordinary landscape of her ordinary life. Somewhere out there, people were living as she had been living, measuring their days in dollars and hours, and careful calculations about what they could afford and what they could not. And here she was, standing in a second-floor apartment, surrounded by documents that represented more wealth than she had ever imagined possessing. The weight of it was almost unbearable. Not the weight of the money itself, but the weight of what it meant, what it would change, what responsibilities it would create. She could pay off her debts, she could leave her job, she could move, travel, invest, build something that mattered. But she could also become a target for her family, for people she did not know, for systems that dealt with wealth in ways she did not understand. She needed help. She needed someone who could guide her through the process, who understood financial documents and legal requirements, who could protect her while she figured out what to do next. But first, she needed to secure what she had found. The documents were valuable, fragile, irreplaceable. They could not stay spread across her apartment floor. They needed to be stored properly, protected, kept safe until she could take the next steps. Sarah spent the rest of the evening carefully repackaging the documents. She used acid-free folders she purchased from an art supply store, separating the certificates by type and company, labeling each one clearly. The journal went into its own protective sleeve. The bearer bonds, the most liquid and potentially the most valuable, were placed in a waterproof container she normally used for important personal documents. By midnight, everything was organized, cataloged, and stored back in the chest's hidden compartment. She slid the false bottom back into place, feeling it lock with the same quiet click that had signaled its opening. The chest looked exactly as it had before, unremarkable, just a piece of furniture taking up space in a small apartment. But Sarah knew better now. She knew what it held, what it represented, what it would demand of her. She lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, her mind racing through scenarios, possibilities, fears. The apartment around her felt different, charged with potential and danger in equal measure. She was no longer just a woman struggling to make ends meet. She was the custodian of a fortune, hidden for generations, waiting to be claimed. And claiming it, she was beginning to understand, would require more than just authentication and appraisal. It would require her to step into a version of herself she had never imagined, someone who could navigate wealth, who could protect what she had found, who could honor the legacy her ancestors had built while creating something new with it. The chest, sitting silent in the next room, offered no guidance. It had done its job, preserving what had been entrusted to it, waiting for the right person to unlock its secrets. Now that person was her, and the question of what came next belonged entirely to Sarah. The following Monday, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. The lie came easily, a stomach bug, nothing serious. She would be back in a few days. Her supervisor accepted the explanation without question, accustomed to her reliability, assuming this was a rare but genuine need. She spent the morning researching, making lists of people and organizations that specialized in historical financial documents, auction houses that dealt with antique stocks, appraisers who certified bearer bonds, law firms that handled estate discoveries. Each search revealed a world she had not known existed, a quiet industry built around finding and liquidating assets that had been lost, forgotten, or hidden. She made preliminary calls, speaking carefully, revealing only that she had come into possession of historical financial documents and needed professional guidance. The responses varied. Some were dismissive, suggesting she mail photographs for a preliminary assessment, their tone suggesting they heard from people like her often, people who believed they had found something valuable, but usually had not. Others were more engaged, asking detailed questions, requesting information about dates, denominations, conditions. One name appeared repeatedly in her searches, a firm in the city specializing in historical securities, documents that proved ownership in companies that had existed decades or centuries ago. The firm's website was professional, restrained, featuring testimonials from clients who had discovered old stocks in attics, safety deposit boxes, and estate sales. The language was careful, avoiding promises of specific values, emphasizing the importance of authentication and proper legal process. Sarah called them late in the morning, her heart racing as the phone rang. Historical Securities Authentication. This is Jennifer. Hello, Sarah paused, suddenly uncertain how to explain. I found some old stock certificates and bonds. I need to know if they're worth anything. There was a brief pause, then a patient reply. That's what we specialize in. Can you tell me what you found? How old are they, and what companies do they represent? Sarah described the discovery carefully, mentioning Standard Oil, American Tobacco, the bearer bonds from the 1920s. She kept her tone neutral, factual, avoiding the words fortune or inheritance, not wanting to sound naive or desperate. Jennifer's tone shifted slightly, becoming more focused. And these have been stored, how? In a cedar chest, hidden compartment. They're in excellent condition, protected from light and moisture. Good. That matters. Stock certificates and bonds can lose value if they've deteriorated. You said you have bearer bonds from the 1920s? Yes. 15 of them. $10,000 denominations. Another pause, longer this time. I see. Those would need very careful authentication. Bearer bonds from that era can be extremely valuable if they're legitimate, but they can also be fraudulent or already redeemed. You'd need a specialist to verify them. That's why I'm calling. Of course. Let me ask you this. Do you have any documentation about where these came from? Family records? A will? Anything that establishes provenance? Sarah thought about the journal, about her grandfather's note at the end. Yes, there's a journal, written by the person who purchased them, explaining the investments. Excellent. Provenance is critical. Without it, even legitimate certificates can be difficult to liquidate. Jennifer's voice warmed slightly, becoming less scripted. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're describing could be significant, but it's also complicated. We'd need to see everything, photograph it, research the companies, trace mergers and splits, verify that the bonds haven't been redeemed. That process takes time, and it's not cheap. How much? Our initial consultation is $500. That includes a preliminary assessment and authentication of up to 10 items. If you want us to handle the full process, research, legal verification, liquidation, we work on commission, typically 15% of whatever we're able to recover. 15%. Sarah did the math quickly. If the certificates and bonds were worth even $100,000, the firm would take $15,000. But if they were worth more, much more, that percentage became substantial. Still, she had little choice. She did not have the expertise to do this herself, and attempting to navigate the process alone would likely result in mistakes, missed opportunities, or worse, being taken advantage of by less scrupulous people. I'd like to schedule a consultation, Sarah said. Great. We're booking about 2 weeks out right now. Does that work for you? 2 weeks felt like an eternity. Sarah wanted answers immediately, wanted confirmation that what she had found was real, that her life was about to change. But she forced herself to be patient. That's fine. What do I need to bring? Everything. All the certificates, bonds, and any documentation you have. We'll photograph them here in a secure environment and return everything to you the same day. Don't try to scan or copy them yourself. That can sometimes damage antique paper. And don't tell anyone what you've found. Not yet. These things can attract attention you don't want." The warning sent a chill through Sarah. She had not considered that aspect. The idea that wealth could make her a target, that people might react to her discovery in ways she could not predict or control. "I understand." "Good. I'll put you down for 2 weeks from today, 10 a.m. You'll meet with Marcus. Yes, that's actually his name. He's our lead specialist in early 20th century securities. He'll take good care of you." Sarah thanked her and ended the call, then sat in silence, processing what had just happened. She had set something in motion, a process that would either confirm her discovery or reveal it to be less significant than she hoped. Either way, there was no going back now. The 2 weeks that followed were among the longest of Sarah's life. She returned to work, resuming her routines, but everything felt different, filtered through the knowledge of what waited at home. She found herself distracted during meetings, her mind drifting to the chest, to the documents hidden inside it, to the possibilities they represented. She told no one, not her co-workers, not the few friends she still kept in contact with, certainly not her family. Jennifer's warning had been clear, and Sarah heeded it instinctively. The discovery was hers alone for now, a secret that felt both empowering and isolating. At night, she returned to the chest repeatedly, opening the false bottom, checking that the documents were still there, still intact. It felt irrational. But she could not help herself. The discovery had been so improbable, so unlikely, that part of her feared it might somehow disappear, revealed to be a dream or a mistake. She also began preparing for what might come next. She researched financial advisors, accountants who specialized in sudden wealth, lawyers who handled trust and estate matters. She read articles about people who had come into unexpected money, how they had managed it, the mistakes they had made, the lessons they had learned. Many of the stories were cautionary, tales of fortunes lost through poor decisions, bad advice, or simply the inability to adapt to a new reality. Sarah was determined not to become one of those cautionary tales. Whatever the appraisal revealed, whatever the documents were worth, she would approach it carefully, thoughtfully, with the same discipline that had allowed her to survive 3 years of post-divorce poverty. Finally, the day of the consultation arrived. Sarah took a personal day from work, citing a family matter that required her attention. It was not entirely a lie. This was about family, about a legacy that had passed through generations before reaching her. She packed the documents carefully in a nondescript bag, carrying it to her car, with a paranoia that felt both excessive and justified. The drive to the city took 40 minutes, traffic heavy but manageable. The firm was located in a professional building downtown, its entrance marked by a small brass plaque that offered no details beyond the company name. Inside, the office was quiet, tastefully furnished, designed to convey competence without ostentation. A receptionist greeted her warmly and directed her to a conference room where Marcus, the specialist Jennifer had mentioned, was already waiting. He was older than Sarah expected, probably in his 60s, with white hair and glasses that gave him the appearance of a professor or librarian. He stood as she entered, offering a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. "Sarah, good to meet you. Jennifer told me a bit about what you found. I'm very curious to see it." Sarah set the bag on the table, suddenly nervous. What if she had misjudged? What if the documents were worthless, and she had built this moment up into something it was not? Marcus seemed to sense her hesitation. "Take your time. This can be overwhelming." "Let's start with whatever you're most comfortable showing me." Sarah opened the bag and carefully removed the first folder, the one containing the Standard Oil certificates. She placed them on the table, and Marcus leaned forward immediately, his expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention. He picked up the first certificate gently, holding it by the edges, examining it under the light. His eyes moved across the paper, taking in details Sarah had not thought to look for: the quality of the printing, the texture of the stock, the signatures at the bottom. "This is authentic," he said quietly. 1911, Standard Oil, pre-breakup. Do you know what that means? Sarah shook her head. Marcus set the certificate down carefully and looked at her with an expression that was part excitement, part gravity. In 1911, Standard Oil was broken up by the government into multiple companies. Those companies became some of the largest corporations in the world. Shares purchased before the breakup can be traced through decades of mergers and splits, and their value can be extraordinary. He picked up another certificate, then another, examining each one with the same careful attention. "How many of these do you have?" 23 Standard Oil certificates, different years, different denominations. Marcus exhaled slowly. "And you said there are other companies too?" "Yes, American Tobacco, railroads, utilities, and bearer bonds." "Show me the bearer bonds." Sarah removed the waterproof container and opened it, revealing the 15 bonds, each one pristine, their ornate designs still vivid despite their age. Marcus stared at them for several seconds without speaking. "These are real," he finally said, his voice almost reverent. "Bearer bonds from the 1920s, unredeemed. If they haven't been claimed, and from their condition, I'd guess they haven't, they're worth their face value plus accumulated interest. Do you understand what that means?" Sarah's mouth was dry. Not exactly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and cleaning them absently. "Bearer bonds are payable to whoever holds them. There's no registration, no record of ownership beyond physical possession. When these were issued, they were essentially cash in paper form. A $10,000 bond from 1928, with interest, could be worth significantly more today. I'd need to calculate the exact amounts, but we're talking about potentially double or triple the face value." He put his glasses back on and looked at her directly. "Sarah, do you understand what you've brought me?" "I'm starting to. This isn't a small find. This isn't a few $1,000s you can deposit and forget about. What you have here represents serious wealth, life-changing wealth, and that means we need to be very, very careful about how we proceed." Marcus's words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the full weight of what she had stumbled into. Life-changing wealth. The phrase felt too large, too abstract, something that happened to other people in stories, not to women who lived in second-floor apartments and worried about whether they could afford new tires for their aging car. "What do we do next?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Marcus stood and walked to a cabinet, returning with a camera and several pairs of white cotton gloves. "First, we document everything. Every certificate, every bond, every page of that journal. We photograph them, catalog them, and then we begin the authentication process. That means verifying the paper, the printing, the signatures, everything that proves these are genuine and not reproductions." "How long does that take?" "For a collection this size? Several weeks, possibly months. Each company needs to be researched. We have to trace corporate histories, mergers, acquisitions, name changes. For the bonds, we need to verify they haven't been redeemed, which means checking federal records, working with the Treasury Department. It's meticulous work." Sarah watched as he carefully photographed the first Standard Oil certificate, documenting it from multiple angles, noting details in a leather-bound log. His movements were practiced, efficient, the work of someone who had done this hundreds of times, but never lost respect for the materials he handled. "Can you give me an estimate?" Sarah asked. "Even a rough one?" Marcus paused, setting down the camera. "I can give you a preliminary assessment based on what I'm seeing, but understand that this is not a guarantee. Values can fluctuate based on authentication results, market conditions, and how we structure the liquidation." "I understand." He picked up one of the Standard Oil certificates again, studying it. A certificate like this, authenticated and traced through the corporate splits, could be worth anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on how many shares it represents after adjustments. Sarah's breath caught. "And I have 23 of them." "Yes. Then there are the American Tobacco shares, which went through similar breakups. The railroad stocks are trickier. Some of those companies went bankrupt, but others were absorbed by larger corporations. The utility companies, if they still exist, or were acquired by entities that do, could also be substantial." He set the certificate down and picked up one of the bearer bonds, holding it almost reverently. "But these, Sarah, these are the real treasure. Unredeemed bearer bonds from the 1920s are incredibly rare. Most were cashed decades ago or destroyed. The fact that you have 15 of them in this condition, with documentation proving provenance." He shook his head slowly. "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen a discovery quite like this. What are they worth?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, calculating. "Conservative estimate, factoring in face value and compounded interest over 90-plus years, each bond could be worth between $3 and $5 million. The number hit Sarah like a physical force. She had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "Each?" "Each. And you have 15. The math was impossible to process. 15 bonds at even $3 million each was $45 million. At $5 million each, it was $75 million. And that was just the bonds, not counting the stock certificates, which Marcus had suggested could be worth millions more." "How much?" Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much total are we talking about?" Marcus set down the bond and removed his glasses, meeting her eyes with an expression that was both excited and grave. "If everything authenticates the way I think it will, if the bonds are unredeemed and the stocks trace through successfully, you could be looking at somewhere between $200 and $300 million. The room tilted. Sarah heard the words, understood them individually, but together they formed something her mind could not quite grasp. $200 to $300 million. It was an amount that existed in news articles about lottery winners and tech entrepreneurs, not in the lived experience of ordinary people. "That can't be right," she said. "I know it sounds impossible, but bearer bonds compound interest for decades. Stock splits multiply share values exponentially. Your ancestors didn't just save money, Sarah. They accidentally created one of the most successful long-term investment portfolios I've ever analyzed. And then they hid it so well that it stayed untouched for generations, allowing it to grow without interference." Sarah stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the energy coursing through her. She walked to the window, looking down at the street below where people moved with purpose and routine, their lives unfolding in predictable patterns. She had been one of them an hour ago. Now she was something else entirely, though she did not yet know what. "I need to sit down," she said, even though she was already standing. Marcus smiled gently. "This is normal. Take your time. We'll proceed at whatever pace feels right to you." They spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. Marcus photographed each certificate and bond, noting serial numbers, issue dates, denominations, and condition. He examined the journal page by page, photographing her great-grandfather's meticulous entries, her grandfather's final note. Sarah watched, trying to absorb the reality of what was happening, but it felt distant, as though she were observing someone else's life rather than living her own. By early afternoon, the documentation was complete. Marcus packaged everything carefully, placing the originals in archival sleeves, organizing them in protective boxes. "These stay with you," he said. "We work from the photographs and documentation. Never let the originals out of your possession until we're ready to execute the final transactions." "When will that be?" "Realistically, 4 to 6 months, maybe longer. We can't rush this. One mistake, one missed step in the authentication process, and it could cost you millions. We do this right, we do this carefully, and we do this quietly." "Quietly?" Marcus's expression became more serious. "Sarah, when word gets out, and it will eventually, you're going to become visible in ways you're not prepared for. Family members will suddenly remember how close they were to you. Friends will have investment opportunities that need funding. Strangers will reach out with sob stories, business proposals, and outright scams. The best way to protect yourself is to delay that attention as long as possible." The warning settled heavily on Sarah. She thought about her family, about the will reading, about the resentment that had already been simmering. They had mocked her for accepting the chest, for taking what they saw as junk while they received cash. When they learned what she had actually inherited, that mockery would transform into something else entirely, something potentially dangerous. "What do I do in the meantime?" Sarah asked. "Live your life as normally as possible. Don't change your patterns. Don't make large purchases. Don't tell anyone what you've found. I know that's difficult, but it's essential. And document everything related to the discovery. Dates, photographs, your grandfather's letter, anything that proves this inheritance came to you legitimately. If anyone challenges your ownership, that documentation will be critical." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. She was not just wealthy now. She was responsible for protecting that wealth, for making decisions that would affect not just her own life, but potentially generations to come. Before she left, Marcus gave her his direct phone number and email. "I'll be in touch within a week with preliminary authentication results. In the meantime, if you have any concerns, any questions, anything that feels wrong, contact me immediately. We're in this together now." The drive home felt surreal. Sarah moved through traffic automatically, her mind somewhere else entirely. She kept replaying Marcus's words, the numbers he had mentioned, trying to make them feel real. $200 to $300 million. It was an amount that could solve every problem she had ever had. That could transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. But it could also destroy relationships, create obligations, and attract dangers she could not yet imagine. The fortune hidden in her grandfather's chest was not just wealth, it was responsibility, power, and a test of character that would reveal who she truly was. When she arrived home, she carried the bag containing the documents with exaggerated care, as though it might explode if handled roughly. Inside her apartment, she returned everything to the chest's hidden compartment, slid the false bottom back into place, and stood looking at the piece of furniture that had become the center of her universe. It looked exactly as it always had. Unremarkable, just wood and brass and careful craftsmanship. But Sarah knew better now. She knew what it held, what it represented, what it would demand of her. That night, sleep was impossible. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios. What would she do with the money? Pay off her debts, certainly. Buy a house, probably. Help her friends, maybe. But beyond those immediate answers, the future felt blank, overwhelming in its openness. She thought about her job, about the routine of showing up, logging hours, collecting a paycheck that barely covered her expenses. Could she quit? Should she? The idea felt both liberating and terrifying. Work had given her structure, purpose, a reason to leave the apartment each day. Without it, who would she be? She thought about her family, about the inevitable moment when they would learn what she had found. Would they be happy for her? Would they feel vindicated in Marcus's decision to give her the chest? Or would they feel cheated, angry that the distribution had been so uneven, that she had received so much more than they had? The questions circled endlessly, without answers, until finally exhaustion pulled her into a restless sleep, filled with dreams of opening chests that multiplied infinitely, each one containing another hidden compartment, another secret, another responsibility she had not asked for. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Sarah's life. She returned to work, maintaining her routines, but everything felt performative, as though she were playing a role in a story that had already ended. Her coworkers noticed nothing unusual. Her supervisor commented once that she seemed distracted, but accepted her explanation about family stress without probing deeper. At home, she checked her email obsessively, waiting for updates from Marcus. The first message arrived 5 days after their initial meeting, a brief note confirming that the preliminary authentication of 3 Standard Oil certificates had been completed successfully. The certificates were genuine, the paper and printing consistent with documents from that era, the signatures verified against corporate records. Each subsequent email brought new confirmations. The American tobacco shares were authentic. The railroad stocks, while complex to trace, appeared legitimate. The utility companies had been absorbed by larger corporations, and the shares had value that needed to be calculated based on conversion ratios from decades past. But the real revelation came in week 4, when Marcus sent a message marked urgent. "Sarah, we've completed authentication on the bearer bonds. I need you to call me as soon as possible." Her hands trembled as she dialed his number. He answered on the first ring. "Sarah, I have news. The bonds are legitimate, and we've confirmed through Treasury Department records that none of them have been redeemed. Do you understand what that means? They're still valid. Not just valid. They've been accruing interest continuously since they were issued. We've calculated the compound interest over 96 years, and the numbers are extraordinary. Each $10,000 bond is now worth approximately $4.2 million. Sarah's legs gave out. She sat down hard on her couch, the phone pressed to her ear. $4.2 million? Each, 15 bonds total. That's $63 million just from the bearer bonds. And Sarah, we're only halfway through authenticating the stock certificates. The Standard Oil shares alone are looking like they're worth over $80 million after accounting for all the splits and mergers. The number climbed higher with each word. $63 million from the bonds, $80 million from Standard Oil, and there were still dozens of other certificates to evaluate. "What's the total?" Sarah asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know. Marcus paused, and she could hear papers rustling. "Based on what we've authenticated so far, and conservative projections for what remains, we're looking at approximately $267 million. $267 million. Sarah could not speak. The number was too large, too far outside the realm of her understanding. It represented more wealth than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, more security than she had ever imagined possessing, more responsibility than she knew how to carry. "Sarah, are you still there?" "I'm here. I know this is overwhelming, but we need to start planning for what comes next. Liquidating assets of this value requires careful strategy. We'll need tax attorneys, financial advisors, estate planners. We'll need to structure the transactions to minimize tax liability, protect your privacy, and ensure the money is managed properly. This is not something you can do alone. I understand. Good. I'm going to send you contact information for several professionals I trust. Schedule consultations with them over the next few weeks. Don't commit to anything yet. Just listen. Ask questions. Get a sense of who you want to work with. And Sarah? Yes? Congratulations. What you've inherited is extraordinary. Your ancestors built something remarkable, and now it's yours. Make sure you honor that. After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence for a long time. The apartment around her felt smaller, more temporary, as though it were already fading into the past. She thought about Marcus's letter, about his belief that she would understand what the chest meant, that she would value it properly. He had been right. She did understand. The chest was not just about money. It was about perseverance, about faith in the future, about building something that would outlast the people who created it. Her great-grandfather had saved during the Depression, investing small amounts when others were losing everything. Her grandfather had preserved those investments, protecting them through decades of economic volatility, trusting that they would matter to someone, someday. And now that someone was her. Not because she deserved it more than others, not because she was smarter or more worthy, but because Marcus had seen something in her, had recognized that she would treat this inheritance not as a windfall, but as a responsibility. The question now was how she would live up to that recognition. The process of liquidating the assets took another 3 months. Sarah met with attorneys who explained tax implications, trust structures, and asset protection strategies. She met with financial advisors who proposed investment plans, diversification strategies, and long-term wealth preservation. She met with estate planners who discussed philanthropy, legacy planning, and generational wealth transfer. The language was dense, technical, overwhelming. But Sarah listened carefully, asked questions, and made decisions slowly, deliberately. She was not interested in flashy investments or high-risk strategies. She wanted stability, security, and the freedom to make choices without financial pressure. By month 6, the first transactions were completed. Bearer bonds were redeemed, their values transferred into accounts Sarah had established with the help of her legal team. Stock certificates were liquidated gradually, sold through private transactions that avoided public markets, and the attention that would come with them. Each transaction brought new confirmations of what Marcus had projected. The Standard Oil shares sold for $83 million. The American Tobacco shares brought in $42 million. The railroad and utility stocks, after complex tracing through corporate histories, yielded another $56 million. The bearer bonds, as projected, totaled $63 million. When the final accounting was completed, the total came to $267,400,000. Sarah stared at the number on the financial statement her attorney had prepared, seeing it in print for the first time. It felt both real and impossible, a figure that existed on paper, but had not yet translated into lived experience. "What do I do now?" she asked her attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had guided her through the process with patience and precision. Patricia smiled. "Whatever you want." That's the gift of this kind of wealth. You have choices most people never get. Choices. Sarah had spent years living without choices, making decisions based on necessity rather than desire. She had worked jobs she did not love because she needed income. She had stayed in an apartment she had outgrown because she could not afford to move. She had denied herself small pleasures because every dollar mattered. Now, suddenly, she had more money than she could spend, more security than she could comprehend, more freedom than she knew how to use. The first decision came easily. She quit her job, giving proper notice, offering a polite explanation about pursuing other opportunities. Her supervisor seemed surprised, but not suspicious. assuming she had found a better position elsewhere. Her co-workers threw her a small party, wishing her well, and Sarah accepted their goodbyes with genuine warmth. They had been kind to her, and she would remember that. The second decision took longer. Sarah wanted a house, something permanent, something that felt like home rather than a temporary stopping point. She worked with a realtor who specialized in discreet transactions, properties that were listed privately, sold without public fanfare. She visited dozens of houses before finding one that felt right. A modest home in a quiet neighborhood, nothing ostentatious, nothing that would draw attention. The house cost less than 1% of her wealth, a fraction so small it barely registered as an expense. But it represented something larger than money. It was the first thing she had chosen freely, without compromise or limitation. She moved slowly, furnishing the house with care, selecting pieces that would last, that meant something. The cedar chest came with her, given a place of honor in the study, where she could see it daily, remember what it had held, what it represented. The third decision, the one she had been avoiding, was what to do about her family. 6 months had passed since the will reading, and Sarah had maintained minimal contact. Her mother had called occasionally, her voice strained, her questions probing. "How are you managing? Have you sold that old chest yet? We're thinking about dividing the house sale proceeds. Would you want to be included?" Sarah had deflected, offering vague responses, avoiding specifics. But she knew the silence could not last forever. Eventually, they would notice changes in her life, would ask questions she could not avoid, would demand explanations she was not ready to give. The moment came unexpectedly. At a family gathering she had agreed to attend out of obligation. It was her mother's birthday, a small celebration at the house Margaret had purchased with her portion of Marcus's estate. Sarah arrived late, carrying a modest gift, hoping to blend into the background. David saw her first, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion. "Sarah, didn't expect you to show up. It's Mom's birthday." "Right. How have you been? We haven't heard from you in months." "I've been fine, busy." Richard joined them, his tone more aggressive. "Busy with what? Last we heard, you were still working that office job." Sarah felt the trap closing. She could lie, deflect, maintain the fiction that nothing had changed. Or she could tell the truth. Face whatever reaction came and deal with the consequences. She chose truth. Not out of a desire to prove anything, not out of vindication, but because hiding felt wrong, dishonest, in a way she no longer wanted to embody. "I quit my job," Sarah said quietly. "A few months ago." David's eyes narrowed. "How are you supporting yourself?" "I'm managing." "Did you sell the chest?" Margaret had joined them now, her voice sharp with curiosity. "I told you it wasn't worth keeping. Old furniture like that, nobody wants it anymore." Sarah looked at her mother, at her brothers, at their wives hovering nearby, listening. The room had quieted, everyone sensing something significant about to be revealed. "I didn't sell the chest," Sarah said. "I opened it. There was a hidden compartment. Inside were stock certificates and bonds that my great-grandfather and grandfather had been saving for decades." The silence was absolute. Margaret's face went pale. David's jaw tightened. Richard's expression shifted from suspicion to understanding, then to something darker. "How much?" Richard's voice was flat, controlled. "Enough." "That's not an answer." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "It's the only answer I'm giving right now." "You can't be serious." David stepped closer, his voice rising. "Marcus gave us pocket change while you got a fortune? That's not fair. That's not fair." Sarah's voice cut through his protest, sharper than she had intended. "Fair would have been Marcus leaving everything to charity and leaving all of us with nothing." Fair would have been any of you visiting him before he died, asking how he was, showing you cared about something other than what you'd inherit. He gave you exactly what he thought you deserved. Margaret's voice trembled. How could you say that? We're your family. Family. Sarah felt years of accumulated resentment rising. Feelings she had suppressed for so long they had become almost invisible. You ignored Marcus for years. You dismissed him, mocked him, treated him like he was an embarrassment. And when he died, you didn't mourn him. You calculated what you'd get. That's not family. That's accounting. And you're so much better? Richard's face was flushed now, anger overcoming control. You show up, play the dutiful niece, and walk away with millions while we get scraps. I showed up because I cared, because Marcus mattered to me, not because of what he might leave behind. And yes, I walked away with more than you did, because he trusted me to value what he left, to honor what our grandfather built, to treat it as more than just money. How much? David's voice was louder now, demanding. Tell us how much. Sarah paused, weighing her options. She could refuse, maintain privacy, let them imagine whatever they wanted. Or she could tell them, let the number speak for itself, let them process what it meant. $267 million, Sarah said quietly. The room exploded. Margaret gasped, actually stumbling backward. David's face went from red to white. Richard laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound that held no humor. Their wives began talking simultaneously, their voices overlapping in confusion and accusation. That's impossible, Margaret said. Marcus didn't have that kind of money. He lived in a tiny house. He drove an old car. He lived modestly because he was protecting what our grandfather left him, Sarah said. The chest, the investments, they were never his to spend. They were meant for the next generation, and he chose to give them to me. Why? David's voice broke slightly. Why you? Sarah thought about that question, about all the answers she could give. Because she had listened, because she had asked questions, because she had shown up when Marcus talked about the past, about his father, about the things that mattered to him. But the real answer was simpler and harder to say. Because he thought I'd understand what it meant. And he was right. The gathering dissolved quickly after that. Margaret retreated to her bedroom, refusing to speak. David and Richard left without saying goodbye. Their anger palpable even in silence. Their wives followed, shooting Sarah looks that ranged from envy to outright hostility. Sarah stood alone in the living room, feeling not triumph, but exhaustion. This was what wealth brought. Not just freedom, not just security, but division, resentment, the exposure of fissures that had always existed, but could now no longer be ignored. She left her mother's house and drove to her own, the one she now owned outright, the one that represented her new life. Inside, she sat in the study, looking at the cedar chest, and felt the weight of everything that had happened. She had inherited a fortune, but she had also inherited responsibility, expectation, and the knowledge that money changed everything, including relationships that had once felt permanent. The months that followed were a period of adjustment, of learning how to inhabit a life she had not expected to live. Sarah hired advisors who helped her structure her wealth responsibly, invest it wisely, protect it carefully. She established a trust to manage the bulk of the assets, ensuring that the fortune her ancestors had built would be preserved for future generations. She also began giving it away. Not recklessly, not in ways that would draw unwanted attention, but thoughtfully, strategically. She donated to causes that mattered to her, organizations that worked with people experiencing the kind of financial instability she had known intimately. She funded scholarships for students who needed help, created grants for small businesses trying to grow, supported community programs that had been cut from public budgets. The giving felt right in a way that spending on herself never quite did. The money was enormous, impossible to use up in her lifetime even if she tried. And knowing that it could do more than just secure her own comfort, that it could change lives the way her life had been changed, gave meaning to the inheritance beyond its dollar value. Her family gradually, reluctantly, began to reach out again. Not with apologies exactly, but with awkward attempts at reconnection. Margaret called occasionally, her voice careful, avoiding direct mention of the inheritance. David sent a text on Sarah's birthday, the message brief but cordial. Richard remained distant, his pride apparently wounded beyond quick repair. Sarah responded to each gesture with measured kindness. She did not cut them off, but she also did not pretend that nothing had changed. The inheritance had revealed truths about their relationships that could not be unlearned. They would move forward, but differently, with boundaries Sarah had not known she needed until they were tested. One afternoon, nearly a year after opening the chest, Sarah received a package in the mail. No return address, just her name and a postmark from a city she did not recognize. Inside was a small wooden box, simply made but carefully crafted, and a note written in handwriting she knew immediately. It was from Marcus, or rather, it had been written by Marcus, left with instructions to be delivered a year after his death. Sarah, the letter began, "If you're reading this, then you've found what I left you, and hopefully you've figured out what to do with it. I wanted to wait a year to send this, to give you time to adjust, to process, to become the person this inheritance will require you to be. The box is a small thing, made by my father when I was young. He gave it to me when I left home, told me to keep it safe, to remember where I came from. Inside is nothing valuable, just a few items that mattered to him. But I wanted you to have it, to remember that wealth is not just money. It's memory, connection, the tangible evidence that people lived and cared and built something that outlasted them. You're going to face challenges I can't predict. People will want things from you. They'll have reasons that sound good, needs that feel legitimate. Some will be genuine, others won't. Trust yourself to know the difference. And remember this: the fortune you inherited was never about the money. It was about proving that patience, discipline, and faith in the future can create something extraordinary. Your great-grandfather and grandfather built this over their entire lives. They sacrificed, saved, and believed that their efforts would matter to someone someday. That someone is you, Sarah. Make sure it matters. Marcus. Sarah opened the small box with trembling hands. Inside were simple things: a pocket watch that no longer worked, a faded photograph of her great-grandfather standing beside a partially built piece of furniture, a small carving of a bird, worn smooth by decades of handling. Nothing valuable in monetary terms, but priceless as evidence of lives lived, hands that had worked, hearts that had hoped. She placed the box on the shelf beside the cedar chest, where they would sit together, reminders of where she had come from and what she carried forward. That evening, Sarah sat in her study, looking at the two pieces of furniture that had changed her life, the chest that had held a fortune, the box that held memory. Both mattered equally, in different ways. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, struggling to pay rent, measuring her life in careful increments, never imagining that something like this could happen. That woman felt distant now, almost like a stranger, someone she remembered fondly but could no longer fully inhabit. The woman she was now had responsibilities that woman had never imagined. She had wealth that required management, decisions that affected not just her own life, but the lives of people she had never met, opportunities that came with obligations she was still learning to navigate. But beneath the changes, something essential remained. She was still Sarah, still the person who had listened to Marcus talk about his father, who had asked questions when others dismissed the past, who had valued a cedar chest not for what it might contain, but for what it represented. And that, perhaps, was why Marcus had chosen her. Not because she would use the money perfectly, not because she had all the answers, but because she understood that wealth was responsibility, that inheritance was obligation, that fortune was not just about receiving, but about honoring what had been built and passing it forward. The chest sat silently in the study, its secret revealed, its purpose fulfilled. It had held a fortune for generations, waiting for the right person to discover it. And now it held only memory, evidence of what had been. Reminder of what was possible when people built with care and preserved with intention. Sarah stood and ran her hand along its surface one final time that evening, feeling the smooth wood, the careful joints, the craftsmanship that had outlasted the man who created it. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of managing the inheritance, of making decisions about giving and investing and protecting what remained. Tomorrow, she would be the custodian of a fortune that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. But tonight, she simply stood in the quiet of her own home, in a life she had built with money she had inherited from people who had believed the future was worth investing in, and felt grateful for the improbable chain of events that had brought her here. The chest had been a gift. But more than that, it had been a test. A question posed across generations. What would you do if you were given the chance to start again, to build something meaningful, to honor the past while creating the future? Sarah was still finding her answer. But she knew now, with certainty, that the answer mattered. Not just to her, but to everyone who came after, to the legacy that would continue long after she was gone, to the quiet belief that what we build today can change lives we will never see. The cedar chest had done its job. It had preserved. It had protected. It had waited. And when the moment came, it had revealed exactly what it had been designed to hold. Not just fortune, but faith that someone, someday, would understand what that fortune meant. Sarah turned off the light in the study and walked toward the rest of her house, toward the life that was still unfolding, toward the future that was now hers to shape. Behind her, in the darkness, the chest remained, solid and silent, its story told, its purpose fulfilled, its legacy secured. And somewhere, she imagined, Marcus was satisfied. He had made the right choice. He had trusted the right person. And the fortune he had protected, built by people who had believed in patience and perseverance, would continue to matter, to make a difference, to prove that what we leave behind can be as important as what we live through. The inheritance was hers now. All of it. The money, the responsibility, the legacy, the challenge of honoring what had been built while creating something new. Sarah was ready. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.